Greetings, brothers and sisters. It is I, your humble messenger, brother Deonde Belmont from the illustrious noble house of Belmont, and today is February 20th, 2976 of the Berber calendar, which is equivalent to your 2026 Gregorian calendar. And like always, which I love to say here, which many of you should start saying now, it is a beautiful time to be alive. I like to give honors to our Creator, the Divine Heavenly Father, our earthly Mother, as well. I have to give honors to our saints and martyrs who have come and gone, our kings and queens who have come and gone, as well as our present king and queen. I have to give honors to the trustees, to the humble nobles, as well as the noblest, to the brothers and sisters who are doing the random good acts and deeds all the time, wherever they are in the four corners of the world. And with that being said, brothers and sisters, please like, share, subscribe if this information that you're going to be listening to today is going to resonate either with you or if you feel that it's going to be important or resonate with someone else. So once again, we're going to be talking about Sister Elizabeth Key Grinstead. Now, for those of you who have pretty much have probably been on any of my other platforms that I frequent, you probably heard me speak about her. And today I had to talk about her once again because this is what Black History Month, and underneath Black History Month, which I like to call Veiled Month, because when you're in the black, you're in the dark, so that means you pretty much you don't know anything, you're in the unknown. And I like to bring the things that was hidden in the unknown or buried in the past back to the forefront, because we're now living in a time where this information is going to be pivotal for many of you who are going to be listening to this lesson today. And I don't want to keep you too long because I know we all still live in the days and times where we have things to do. But I hope that you can take the time out to like, share, subscribe to the channel, as well as make sure that if this information, once again, if it does resonate with you, or if it resonates with someone who you feel that it pertains to, go ahead and make sure you send them this way, because we are those long lost heirs in the English Empire that is now known as the United States. I've already done lessons regarding showing our genealogy, going all the way back to time immemorial, actually, and before, to corroborate with our claim regarding who we are, who we say we are. But we're not here right now in this video to argue that point. Excuse me. We're here to talk about, once again, Sister Elizabeth Key Grinstead. And now, one thing that many of you don't know about Sister Elizabeth Key Grinstead was that she was the one who had the very first case here in so-called America in regard to the discrepancy of slavery and her slavery or first freedom case here in America. And that case itself, which pretty much changed a lot of legislation here that pertains to the man, woman, as well as child status all together. And without knowing this history, you would think that what's taking place here today, especially in many of the households that we live in, was all just by mere coincidence, when this was actually a design that was pretty much set up going back centuries way before many of you and I have pretty much any type of life in our body. But we're going to be able to get down to the nitty gritty in regards to how did this situation happen here in America. So once again, today's lesson is about Elizabeth Key Grinstead, a woman who forced Colonial Virginia to confront a question that the colony had tried to keep strategically vague. And that was what makes a person free or enslaved in America in regarding to their parentage, Christianity, aka their religion, the contract status, aka if there was an indentured servant, or something else. Her freedom suit was culminating in 1656, and that not merely frees one family, and it sits at the hinge between a world in which unfree labor could be framed through indentured and status disputes, and a world moving toward hereditary racial slavery, codified with new legal logic in the decade that followed. So with that being said, please like, share, subscribe. Let's go ahead and get started on this video so that way we can go move forward to the rest of this lesson.
I am Elizabeth Key. I was born in Virginia. I was not born free. I was not born enslaved by law either. When I was born, the law had not yet decided what I was. My father was an Englishman. He acknowledged me. He had me baptized. In that time, those things mattered. Baptism meant something, an English father meant something, but my mother was African, and that mattered too. When my father died, I was bound out, not for a lifetime, for a term. But when that term ended, I was not released. The rules changed quietly without asking me. I worked inside the household, cooking, cleaning, watching children grow while my own life stood still. I was watched, measured, corrected. I learned quickly when to speak. I knew the law because it had been used against me, so I learned how to use it back. I argued 3 things: that my father was English, that I was baptized, that I had served my time. They did not expect me to speak this way. The courtroom was not dramatic, it was tense.
All right, so I had to pause it right there. I was trying to pause it before. Excuse me. So you heard what she said. She was already comfortable with the courtroom because she understood law. She was hearing it pretty much throughout her life, based off of what she was saying in this narrative. But 2 things that really stood out. I know she said 3, but it was 2 things that was very important that stood out that she said that she stood upon. The main one was her father's status, which was English. Her father had an English status. And 2, she was part of the church, so she was a Christian. Part of the what church? The Church of England, because at this time in the territory that we called Virginia, everything was still underneath the auspices of the Church of England in regards to religion. There was no other so-called established church here or religion based off of that time frame. So those are the 2 things that she utilized. But the main one that firstly that stood out was the fact that she stood on her father's status in regards to her being him being English. So what her father was, she still is, no matter how much time has passed. And the same way with you, many of you brothers and sisters, you are who your forebears were without doubt or contradiction. So if she was able to do this work because she remembered, you should be able to do this great work by remembering, aka doing your genealogy to see if this also is you. But I don't want to go down that hole. Let's go ahead and continue the video because it was almost done.
My life was discussed as property, as precedent. But the law had not yet closed, and that mattered. I won, I was declared free, I married, I built a family. For a moment, it felt like the future opened. They did not celebrate my case, they studied it, and then they rewrote the law. Children would now follow the condition of the mother. My freedom became the reason others would never have it. I lived free, I raised children, but I watched the world change. What had once been uncertain became fixed, permanent, inheritable. My records end. My death is not carefully documented, but the laws written after me remained, and they shaped everything that followed. I did not end slavery, but I proved it had to be built, and when the system was threatened, it changed the rules. Stay bold, stay curious, and keep uncovering the truth behind the myth.
Okay, I gotta get better and stop allowing myself being, not able to have my mic unmuted. But I also wanted to say, so I have to give a credit to the creator of that video, even though most of it was AI generated, but it's the point of what she was explaining in there in regard to Elizabeth Key Grinstead and what she have done in her lifetime that still impacts us today. And we're going to read a little bit more about her by utilizing Wikipedia. And I know a lot of folks may have their issues with Wikipedia, but we don't really care because the information you can go verify the source just by you know, looking at the numbers and the letters that goes under the information. So we're going to go ahead and do that right now. Um, Start reading from the the Wikipedia page. All right. Apologize. It seems like once again, as soon as you want to do something, it starts giving you problems. All right. So Elizabeth Key Grinstead, born 1630 or 1632 in the territory known as Warwick County, Virginia. It says she was one of the first black people in the 13 colonies, and we're just utilizing the term black for the sake of what's inside the article or Wikipedia, to sue for freedom from slavery and win. Key won her freedom and that of her infant son, John Grinstead, on July 21st, 1656, in the colony of Virginia. Key based her suit on two connected arguments. One, her father's status as a free Englishman and her status as an indentured servant. Pause. Now, we know at that time, you know, especially in the 13 colonies, before there was so called slavery, it was indentured servitude. And many of those indentured individuals, which I'm going to actually just going to show you, were underneath these contracts, which will call similar to internships. So an indentureship was an internship, which meant that you were going to be putting some work in for a certain amount of time before you had the ability to be considered, you know, free from your contract. Now, in this case, in those indentures, they were most of them were paying for their way to come over here in the territory they call the New World or America. But we'll talk about that, the discrepancies of a lot of that information later down the road. But what we can say is that the folks who came underneath indentures, based off of anecdotal evidence, that they were family members, brothers, sisters, cousins, you know, people of that nature. So it wasn't just random, you know, so-called slaves or folks who they had no idea who were actually coming over here. They knew exactly who was coming over here in the colonies. So it says once again that Key's father was an Englishman who had acknowledged her and baptized her as a Christian in the American branch of the Church of England. He was a wealthy planter who had tried to protect her by establishing a guardianship for her when she was young. Before his death, this guardianship outlined that her father gave Key away on an indenture which was supposed to end when she turned 15, but this agreement had expired well before the time of the suit. Based on these factors, her attorney and common law husband, William Grinstead, argued successfully that she should be freed. The lawsuit was one of the earliest freedom suits by an African descended person in the English colonies. Pause. Now, once again, the African aspect is because they said her mother was African, you know, because they didn't know where she came from because of the skin tone of many of the brothers and sisters from these territories were the same. You know, didn't know if they did come from that territory, and which we know they didn't. We didn't know if they came from Spain. We didn't know if they came from Portugal, from Great Britain, Germany, wherever. Here in so-called America, they didn't know. But based off of the description of the catch-all term was African or Negro. All right, so 1 second. All right. So let's go ahead and read a little bit further. All right, so in response to Key's suit and other challenges, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed a law in 1662 establishing that the social status of the children born in the colony, bond or free, were to follow the social status of their respective mothers. This law differed from English common law, in which children's social status was determined by their fathers, who had an obligation to support both legitimate and illegitimate children. Pause. So as we can see and we read here, um, no matter legitimate or illegitimate children underneath English common law, the father who the children took status of still had to take care of them regardless. But the point was the father's status is the supreme status under English common law. Well, didn't America adopt English common law? Absolutely. So underneath what we like to call, um, um, I can't think of the name right now, but it's statutes that were kept, that were never, dismantled or removed in regards of the transition from one government power or a sovereign to the next. So in this case, underneath English common law, which America adopted, and underneath English common law, the father had the supreme status of his children, then that should mean ab initio underneath the common law or the English common law that's adopted America, that the children should have the status of the father. But that had pretty much had been blocked because of the empire of the father was dismantled because of judges, and fathers were given their the guardianship of their children to the courts to make sure that the father's will to take care of the children is taken care of. And this was done because a lot of fathers were going to war. We were doing a time of war, so we wanted to make sure, or our ancestors wanted to make sure that the posterity was going to be taken care of, no matter what, so that way we can keep the family going in perpetuity. So, with that being said, we can now see from what's happening now here in America to what happened going back in the 1600s or the late 1600s was the removal of the father as having the supreme status in regards to the children. But this only happened because of, once again, Elizabeth Key Grinstead. She remembered who she was based off of her father's ancestry, as well the religion that she come from, which was the Church of England, or the Christianity underneath the Church of England, because we know that there's many different so-called versions of Christianity that came out of the Church of England, which they call denominations today, or we can call different forms of schisms, but they all come from the Church of England. All right, so let's go ahead and get back into this lesson. All right, so it says, Virginia and other colonies incorporated a principle known as partus sequitur videnturem, or partus, relating to chattel property. So that means that the child takes the status of the mother. So the status of the child follows the mother no matter what, underneath partus sequitur videnturem. So, like they say, the legislation hardened the boundaries of slavery by ensuring that all children born to enslaved women, regardless of paternity or proportion of European ancestry, would be born into slavery unless explicitly freed. So, I know many folks may say all of this stuff have pretty much been destroyed. It no longer exists. This is all the past. And one thing about history is the past is known to repeat itself. History repeats itself, and he or she who does not know their past is likely to repeat it. So, as we can see from this article, or from the lesson of Elizabeth Key Grinstead, that the fathers no longer, once again, have the emphasis of his status on the children based off of where he come from underneath the law. It is now based off of the mother, because she's now been put underneath this new legal fiction, partus sequitur videnturem, that is a Roman fiction. These are Roman statutes, not English, Roman, which now makes the status of the child underneath the mothers based off of slavery. Not over freedom, slavery. So they enslaved the mother underneath this statute, and now whatever comes out, boy or girl, is now enslaved because it ties it back to the mother who was originally slave, unless explicitly, like they stated, explicitly freed otherwise. And we'll talk about that in another video, because many brothers and sisters have no idea that for you to truly free yourself is really by remembering. It's your memory. You just have to be able to remember yourself and be able to speak and stand on it. But that's not what this video is for. Let's continue. So Key's early life and education says Key, sometimes spelled K, was born in 1630 or 1632 in Warwick County, Virginia. Her mother was an indentured African woman, which once again that can be from Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, any territory the so-called melanated people come from. So that's just a catch-all term. And then we also know that the term African is a Berber term. We know for sure based off of that understanding this is a Berber woman or Berber ethnicity. And her father was Thomas Key, an English planter and a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, representing Denby, which was later part of the Warwick County, but it's today's Newport News. Thomas Key's legal white wife lived across the James River in a White County, Virginia. Blah blah blah. A lot of this stuff you can read on your own time, but it's still important. So let me go and continue to it. Said, born in England, the Keys were considered pioneer planters as they had come to Virginia before 1616, remained for more than 3 years, paid their passage, and survived the Indian Massacre of 1622. Around 1636, in a civic case at Blunt Pond Court, Thomas Key was charged with fathering the mixed race Elizabeth Key. Pause. Now, mixed race didn't just mean, so-called skin complexion. Mixed race technically is meaning from different territories, ethnicity-wise. So, like they said, the term multiracial people refers to people who are mixed with two or more races, and the term multi-ethnic people refers to people who are more than one ethnicity. A variety of terms have been used both historically and presently for multiracial people in a variety of contexts, blah, blah, blah. All right, so once again, she could have been, when they said father in the mixed race, anywhere. Him being English, she could have been, once again, as they say, either African, but African could have been from any of the other territories in the North African territory, including up to Great Britain, Portugal, Spain, etc. That territory, because they all look the same. All of those people in that territory because they're all Berber ethnicity. But like I said, I don't want to go too far off in that rant. So initially he denied the charge. Complaints about illegitimate children were brought to court so that fathers will be required to provide support for those children under English common law. Pause. So regardless, even the information that I'm speaking about, it's not about the fathers trying to get out of their duty and their obligation. It's for us to be able to have to say so in regards to bringing the value of what it was as an English father back to the forefront, to be able to help bring the structure and the order and the discipline to have an upholding society underneath God once again, because the English people were a people underneath God. And when you're not honoring the values and the systems that your people were known to do and represent, you lose that protection underneath, in this case, God's protection, God's favor. But once again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, so he says, and including arranging for apprenticeships so that they could learn skills necessary for their livelihood. Pause. So it is the father's obligation and duty to make sure that the children learn whatever skills that they need, so therefore they can actually take care of their livelihood. So today, we don't really put an emphasis on fathers doing that because a lot of them are inside the households. But underneath English law, underneath our history, that was something that we were known to do, what we were supposed to do. And if you didn't do, you were punished. So it's time for us to understand our history and go back to the ways of our forebears. Otherwise, we're going to start suffering the calamities and plagues that they suffered because they stopped honoring what it was needed for them to be a harmonious, successful society under God, once again, according to the laws of nature. Excuse me. All right, so it says, Thomas Key first said an unidentified Turk was Elizabeth's father, but the court relied on witnesses who testified to his paternity. Thomas Key took responsibility for Elizabeth, arranging for her baptism in the established Church of England and supporting her financially. Pause. So let's go back to it. In regards to Thomas Key first said that an unidentified Turk was Elizabeth's father. Now, this information is pretty good, and it's very important to understand because now we're starting to see that based off of the narrative that we're hearing, that Elizabeth Key, she had to have been of a complexion that he was able to pass her off as so-called quote unquote being from a Turk. All right, now we know her mother was so-called African, which quote unquote is Negro, based off of the understanding at that time, and Negro means black, and then those who are known as Turks, which we know were those who were practicing Islam, and Turks, Muslims, Moors were actually interchangeable terms during these times, and we know these were actually and Arabs, and we know all of these people, different groups, sects, were all known to be melanated, which we would say can be described as being Negro. So, based off of that understanding and those facts, we can corroborate and have an inkling idea that Mr. Thomas Key himself also had to have looked the same complexion as his daughter, his daughter's mom, as well as the so-called the people who he said she so-called came from, which was Turks, which we know Turks is a colloquial term in regards to, we know, those who are also practicing either Islam, Muslims, in this case, Moors, which we know all were technically tied back to dark-skinned people, you know. So for that understanding, we also have to have a mind open in regards to knowing that Mr. Thomas Key is also the same complexion of those people. I digress. Let's go ahead and continue. He's an Englishman. All right. So it says, and she was also too, as we see, baptized in the Church of England. So she was Christian. So those of you who's actually part of the Church of England was considered white people. You know, English people in the Church of England was considered white people, especially during this time. And it wasn't about your skin complexion. It's all about status. If you was in the church, in the Church of England, you was considered white. Outside the church, you was considered an infidel, or whatever so-called term that they felt to give it to you. And most likely it was going to be a term that wasn't going to be favorable. So sometime before his death that same year, 1636, Thomas placed Elizabeth, then age 6, to the custody of Humphrey Higginson for a 9-year indenture. All right. Once again, an indenture is a legal contract that reflects an agreement between two parties, although the term is most familiarly used to refer to a labor contract between an employer and a laborer with an indentured servant status. Historically, indentures were used for a variety of contracts. All right. So they didn't just go for just one thing, like you just coming over here to work. It could have been for, you know, to take care of your children for a certain period of time. You know, once you became incapacitated to take care of, so that indenture, or in this case, that transfer of internship, you would go over to someone else who you will be able to, you know, move forward with that contract to make sure that your will is being met, or in this case, the completion of the indenture himself. All right, so it says, Higginson, a wealthy planter who owned several plantations, was expected to act as her guardian until Key reached the age of 15. Considered the coming of age for girls during this period, girls frequently married or began working for wages at the age of 15. Upon reaching age 15, Elizabeth Key would be free. All right, so her indenture, her contract, her internship will end at the age of 15. All right, during this period to an early Virginia, African and European servants were likely to be indentured for a period of years, usually to pay off passage to the Americas. All right, pause. So now what they mean that Africans will have an indenture, which was known as a contract to work for their passage to the Americas. So that have to mean that these were so-called melanated people who was coming over here to work underneath a contract, not so-called slaves, if they call them so-called Africans. And once again, the term African is a catch-all term for just those who are just dark-skinned people. And these dark-skinned people also could have been coming from the same so-called place that these people who they call European or English. All right, so we got to also, brothers and sisters, you have to understand history and don't try to fit how the past operated based off of your modern understanding, because your modern understanding today is actually flawed. You have to have the mindset of the ancients, or like I said, your forebears. Go back into the records and see what these terms meant through different people, because you didn't have all of these so-called different nationalities occupying one space at one time, like this, like how we see today. Things were a little bit more sectioned off, or we can say segregated. Not saying that you didn't have these other nationalities who came, but it wasn't like how we see today. Not at all. All right, so it says once again, during this period in early Virginia, African and European servants were likely to be indentured for a period of years, usually to pay off passage to the Americas. The colony required illegitimate children to be indentured for a period of apprenticeship until they came of age and would be expected to support themselves. While mortality was high, it was common for indentured servants to earn their freedom. Working class people of different ethnicities lived, worked, ate, and played together as equals, and many married or formed unions during the colonial period. All right, Thomas Key intended Higginson to act as Elizabeth Key's guardian, but the latter did not keep his commitment to take the girl with him if he returned to England. Instead, he transferred or sold her indenture to Colonel John Matrom, the first Anglo-European settler of Northumberland County. In about 1640, Matrom moved to the undeveloped county, taking Elizabeth at age 10 with him as a servant. There is little record of Key's next 15 years. Pause. So, as we can see or hear from this record, that which we can understand that a lot of these indentures were illegally transferred. This contract was illegally transferred. So she ended up getting forced to do more work or having an extended indentured servitude with now her new guardian, which is now Colonel John Matrom. So we're going to go ahead and read a little bit more about William Grinstead, as well as Key's freedom suit. Now, in about 1650, Matron paid for passage for about a group of 20 young white English indentured servants to Colonial, his plantation in Northumberland County. To encourage development, the Crown had awarded Virginia colonists head rights of 50 acres of land for each person they transported to the colony. Generally, these persons were indentured servants. Each indentured person was served for 6 years to pay for the passage from England. So 6 years, because you couldn't work past 7 years. You always had to have because during this is religious people, and so during the church time, like I said, there was no bondage after so-called 7 years. All right. So one of these servants was 16-year-old William Grinstead, also spelled Grinstead, a young lawyer. He's considered the immigrant English ancestor of numerous descendants of Grinsteads and spelling variations. Although Grinstead's parents are not known, he may have learned law as the younger son of an attorney. Under the English common law or primogeniture, only the eldest son could inherit the father's real property. So many younger sons crossed the Atlantic to seek their lives and fortunes in the American colonies. Recognizing Grinstead's value, Matrom used the young man for representation in legal matters for Cone Hall. During this period, Grinstead and Elizabeth Key began a relationship and had a son together, whom they named John Grinstead. They were prohibited from marrying while Grinstead was serving his indenture. All right. So as we can see, this is a young lawyer who's also underneath an indentured servant. So as we can see, brothers and sisters, because I know many of you heard of indentured servitude, that it was not all so-called what we have been probably indoctrinated to think of so-called slavery. It wasn't the same thing. Indentured servitudes were not the same thing as so-called slavery. They were two different so-called categories. One, you were born into perpetually. The other, you had came up with an ordeal with the other party in regards to allowing you to work off um, your debt in regards to whatever it was that you need them to do. And in this case, if you wanted to come from so-called over there to come over here and you didn't have the money, you told them, okay, cool, I'll go ahead and work for you for a certain amount of years. But that didn't mean you had lost your skills and your identity or any of that. You still had all of your values and everything who you were all intact. Slavery, you don't have none of that. You don't have no freedoms. You don't have no privileges. And as I'm explaining, there were people who look just like you and I, this dark brown, copper complexion, or whatever we want to describe it as, known as black, whatever, were also English people who will be considered underneath the so-called status white because you were part of the Church of England. All right, let's continue. So Key's 1655 freedom suit, after Mottram died in 1655, the overseers of his state had to sort Mottram's 11 unfree persons in categories of servants, meaning they were born free and signed a contract to make them indentured servants, and Negroes, meaning they were born unfree and are unslaved property of that estate. Due to Key's African heritage, the overseers classified Key and her son John as Negroes, with William Grinstead acting as her attorney. Key sued the estate over her status, saying she was an indentured servant who had served past her term, and that her son was thus freeborn. So based off of that information, if they classified her as Negro, she must look like those same people. But she just told you that A, her indenture was over, and then B, you already heard that her father was an Englishman, which meant that she had to have still, or her father had to have looked just like her for her to be classified as a so-called Negro. I hope this is making sense, brothers and sisters, because this is why I keep saying genealogy. Genealogy is the key. Before you decide to start claiming to be any other of these so-called identities out here, do your genealogy first. Give that a chance. And then once you've been able to disqualify your genealogy, once you've traced it all the way back to a common group based off of the origin of that surname, if you can disqualify that that's not you, hey, more power to you. But if that's what you have, then just be these people. If that's what you have proven based off of your investigation and this is who you are, just be those people. Live that life accordingly. Go back to the ways of your predecessors. Honor their God, our religion, our value system, allegiance back to our King, to the people in regards to how we're going to conduct ourselves moving forward. But let's continue. At 25, Elizabeth had been a servant for a total of 19 years, having served 15 years with Mottram. According to Tanya Lovell Banks in the Akron Law Review, subjecthood rather than citizenship was more important for determining a person's social status in a young colony. Remember that? Your subjecthood. So who were you? All right. So let's read. In the early 17th century, children born to English parents outside the country became English subjects at birth. Others could become naturalized subjects, although there was no process at the time in the colonies. What was unsettled was the status of children if only one of the parents was an English subject, as foreigners, including Africans, were not considered subjects. Because non-whites came to be denied civil rights as foreigners, mixed-race people seeking freedom often had to stress their English ancestry and later European. All right. So this is in the early 17th century. So they're letting you know it was based off of your ancestry. Where did you come from? It wasn't because of your so-called skin complexion. All of that stuff is new. Like I said, that's a separation of based off of the new mindset. But historically, it was based off who did you come from, where did you come from, and the only way for you to prove that you have to know your genealogy. Today, as we can see, this is why they're mixing everybody up, and especially removing or getting them the melanated woman, who's technically the unconscious English woman as well, because they're all mixed up. all mixed up, all the different nations from all the different kingdoms who came over here from the 1400s all the way to so-called present now are all mixed up. The only way for you to know who is who's based off of the genealogy, and that unfortunately is what's causing many of them to just accept the mindset of the corporation today, which is ruling the way people think, the way people act, with a whole artificial mindset. And that is what's causing us to not to be able to enforce the value system of our predecessors, because of now, until we can fix these issues in regards to, as we can see, the status of the mother who the children follow. The father doesn't have a fight in hell, especially if he doesn't know his status going all the way back to his predecessors, in this case, the English people. So this information is really for the English people. And for you to know if you're the English people, you have to do your genealogy, because many of you may have English names, but you may not truly be English people. I digress. So it says Elizabeth has served as a servant for 10 years beyond the terms of her indenture in trying to establish whether Key's father was a free Englishman. The court relied on the testimony of witnesses who knew the people in the case. Nicholas Journal 53 testified in 1655 that he had heard a flying report rumor at York that Elizabeth, a Negro servant to the estate of Colonel John Matrom, whose deceased was the child of Mr. K. Mr. K, who's Key, said that a Turk of Captain Matthews was the father to the girlie. And we already spoke about regards to who or what a Turk could be. And this report is coming from Hardcastle. Black History Shines on New Light on Color. Dayton Daily News, Dayton, Ohio, January 30th, 2003. All right. Banks said Journal's testimony had the most significant effect on the court's decision. The colonists would not have granted Turks the same rights as themselves, as they were not Christian. You see that? So you had to be Christian to have specific certain rights, especially in the colonies, especially during these times, because they were still, fighting against each other. All right. And they couldn't so-called come from France, because at this time, the English was fighting to France, or Great Britain was fighting France and Spain. So they definitely weren't taking and giving them those rights. And that's the reason why we say the term Negro, because the term Negro is what? It's Spanish. So that means that these people who are melanated, who so-called they were calling African, are actually, once again, could come from either so-called North Africa, which could be Moors, also the territory which we know Berbers, also which we know the territory Berbers, which also were the ones in Spain indigenously, as well as Portugal. Also, we can say going all the way to Great Britain and blah blah blah, etc. But the point that we're making is it was based off of where you came from, because the mindset, the ideologies were different. Just because they were dark skinned does not mean that they all came from the same place. All right. So it says, and this was coming from Tanya Lovell Banks, Dangerous Women, Elizabeth Key's Freedom Suit, Subjecthood and Racialized Identity in 17th Century Colonial Virginia, Akron Law Review, 799, 2008. So this is that from where this information is coming from, brothers and sisters. So folks who ask for the citation, recite your sources. Here you go. All right, and then it says, the most persuasive evidence about Elizabeth Key's significant effect on the court's decision was the colonists would, the most persuasive evidence about Elizabeth's paternity came from Elizabeth Newman, 80 years old and a former servant of Matrom, who testified. It was a common fame in Virginia that Elizabeth, a mulatto, and we know what mulatto means. A mulatto is a racial classification refers to people of mixed sub-Saharan, aka Berber ethnicity, and European, aka more Berber ancestry. So just pretty much a mixture of people from either so-called Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, Germany, whatever so-called nation that could technically consider you to be the mulatto. And it comes from various different shades of so-called complexion. who's now a servant to the estate of Colonel John Mottram, deceased, was the daughter of Mr. K, and he said K was brought to Blunt Pont Court and there fined for getting his Negro woman with child, which said Negroes was the mother of the said mulatto, and the said fine was for getting the Negro with child was the said Elizabeth. Other witnesses asserted similar testimony, believing Thomas Key's paternity was proved by common law. The court granted Elizabeth Key her freedom. Mottram Estate appealed the decision to the General Court, which overturned it and ruled that Elizabeth was a slave because of her mother's status as Negro. Through Grinstead, Elizabeth Key took the case to the Virginia General Assembly, which appointed a committee to investigate. They sent the case back to the courts for retrial. Elizabeth Key finally won her freedom on 3 counts. Alright, so once again, brothers and sisters, this is how she won her freedom. The most important one was that by English common law, the father's status determined the child's status. Pause. So this is what we're seeing. The problems going on here in America is because they're not utilizing English common law, even though they adopted it underneath what they call receptive clauses. That's what the word I was thinking of. So these receptive clauses meant that they were going to save or maintain laws or statutes that came from the occupying government prior to the government who's here modernly, in this case the United States. So the United States laws, legislation that you see a lot today came from English common law, or the foundation of American law is English law. Alright, so English common law has the father as the supreme head of the children. That's the status that the children are supposed to be underneath under the English common law. We speak English today. This territory was the territory that the English occupied. We still have English ancestry. We're still underneath our English value system based off of my household, who I am, which we said the noble house of Belmont. So therefore, my children ab initio are underneath my status. I am still part of the English Church or the Church of England. I also still have my allegiance to the King of England, because for those of you who know about perpetual allegiance, doesn't matter how much time it went past, no matter where you are in the world, if you have English ancestry, you came from England during that time, you are still an English subject. Alright, so let's go ahead and continue. So although Elizabeth Key, went too far. So through Grinstead, Elizabeth Key took the case to the Virginia General Assembly, which appointed a committee to investigate. They sent the case back to the courts for retrial. Elizabeth Key finally won her freedom on, once again, those 3 counts that her underneath English common law, her father's status determined his child status. Her father was a free Englishman, and she was a practicing Christian. In the other cases, the courts had ruled that black, aka Negro or Indian Christians, could not be held in servitude for life. The assembly may also have been influenced by the reputation of Elizabeth's planter father, Thomas Key, who wanted to carry out his wishes after he had acknowledged his daughter. In addition, the father of her mixed-race child was 3/4 white, was himself an English subject. The court ordered Mottram's estate to compensate Key with corn and clothes for her lost years. Although Elizabeth Key won her court battle for freedom for her and her son John, she and Grinstead could not marry until he completed his indenture in 1656. Theirs was one of the few recorded marriages between an Englishman and a free woman of African descent in the 17th century. They had another son together before William Grinstead died early in 1661. The widow Elizabeth Grinstead remarried to the widower John Pierce, John Pierce, upon his death. She and her sons, John and William Grinstead II, inherited 500 acres, helping to secure their future. The property enabled Elizabeth Grinstead and her sons to get on. Among the many descendants of Elizabeth Key and William Grinstead in the South are believed to be those named Grinstead and people with variations of the surname, which such as Grinstead, 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 and Grimstead. Alright. And then the aftermath. This is the nitty gritty, and this is the most important part before we start going to the rest of the other pages I want to go ahead and show before we wrap up this lesson. Alright, so Now keep the aftermath there. Let's go take a look at the other pages. So this right here is what I wanted to show you, which is from the Norman B. Leventhal Map and Education System at the Boston Public Library. And this is called A New and Accurate Map of the English Empire in North America, representing their rightful claim as confirmed by charters and the formal surrender of their Indian friends, likewise the encroachments of the French with the several forts they have unjustly erected therein. Alright. And it says, name on the item by the Society of Anti-Gallicans, date 1755. So this is 100 years after Elizabeth Key Grinstead. Alright, so let's take a look at the map. Alright, remember she's from Virginia. Alright, so this is the area. Warwick County. So that's, I would say, over here. Over here in this area. Alright. And it says by charter 1665. And then up here it says, because Virginia was far. Virginia was this whole part. Actually, the whole country at the time was known as Virginia, but you know, it's we'll talk about that in another video too. And then you see right here, bounds of Virginia and New York by charter of 1606. All right, so the charter of 1606, that is the Virginia Charter of 1606, signed by King James the First of England, Sixth of Scotland. Now, we know he wasn't a true Englishman. He only got there based off of rights of him being related to Queen Elizabeth I from the House of Stuart. Other than that, he's truly not an Englishman. So he was pretty much just utilizing the rights and the prerogatives of the de jure English people. So that's why a lot of this information that you're going to learn about is going to kind of throw you for a loop, because it's going to pretty much question and challenge the narrative that you have come to believe. Alright, so we're going to talk about the first Virginia Charter before we talk about the aftermath. So the first Virginia Charter, the first Charter of Virginia, also known as the Charter of 1606, is a document from King James I of England to the Virginia Company, assigning land rights to colonists for the creation of a settlement which could be used as a base to export commodities to Great Britain and create a buffer preventing total Spanish control of the North and South American coast. The land is described as coastal Virginia and in islands near to the coast, and stretches from present-day South Carolina to present-day Maine. The patch of land itself will remain the property of the king. Alright, so remember, so the property of the king is the land. The king owns the land. But as it says, with the London Company and the Plymouth Company, the two divisions of the Virginia Company, they're the king's tenants. So they're tenants of the king. And the settlers are subtenants. Alright, so the king owns the land. The sub companies, aka the Virginia Company, the Plymouth Company, they're the king's tenants. And then the settlers are the subtenants, because the settlers themselves are getting the rights for and protections from their tenant, who's the company. And the company's only having the right to do what they do because of the owner, who is the king. Alright, and this is still set down in stone today. Why? Because of the descendants of the king and the descendants of those people who are underneath this charter are still here, which we're speaking in regards to, as we just heard about who? Elizabeth Key Grinstead, because she's in the same territory as what? The first charter of Virginia. Alright? So if she's in the territory of the first charter of Virginia, that means that this information is also applicable to those of you who can relate to who she is. So when I'm saying relate to who she is, I'm saying once you realize your ancestry coming from these territories or come from these people, you too have a claim once you come back home and pledge your allegiance back to the king and get back right in regards to who your forebears were, because you can't maintain a charter underneath the king if you yourself does not have your allegiance underneath the crown themselves. Especially as you can see, you're a subtenant. You're not the tenant, you're a subtenant. So your charter itself can be revoked, and many of you don't understand, but you don't own the land. So for those of you who say you have land patents, who do you get that land patent from? Only one who can grant land patents or charters was who? The king. All right, so you don't own any land. You can't own anything. You can only just control it. All right, you have a use to it. You can have heirs, and they can continue to keep using it as long as you continue to keep having them, but you never can own it. Never can own it. Let's continue. All right. So it says the colony's government at first consisted of a council residing in London. The document designated the London Company as responsible for financing the project, which included recruiting settlers and also provided for their transport and supplies. Okay. The purpose of the charter. The charter favored the king's interest. The king did not invest but was entitled to 20% in profit. The charter also granted those born in the colonies all the rights of English citizens elsewhere, and that they are compensated and protected in case they were robbed or spoiled by anyone. Pause. So as you can see, Elizabeth Key Grinstead, because she's a descendant, she's an English heir, she's protected underneath these charters. And as we read, they said that she also have who? Descendants. So that means her descendants are also protected underneath these charters. Brothers and sisters, you understand this. You follow who you come from. You are who you come from. You're not somebody new. You're not because you think you are. You're not any of these so-called new fictions that you have literally led yourself to believe. But in law, they know who you are. They allow you to play this fairy tale that you want. They're just waiting till when you're going to stop playing around and understand who you are and get right. But if you don't want to get right, then they have no problem in creating an environment to keep you contained in, so you can continue to keep living out your fantasy, because that's pretty much what many of you are doing. You're just living out your fantasy. You don't know who you are. You are placating into a facade that they want you to stay in, and so they're going to continue to keep doing, just giving you everything you want, so that way you can stay in La La Land. But me being the water bearer, I'm here to bring you back your memories. I'm here to give you something, so therefore it's literally supposed to heal you, quench your thirst. And air is the intelligence, so I'm bringing you your intelligence via the air, the airways, online. And I'm not just doing this, the king is doing this, and you have other brothers and sisters who are doing a great work. But it's up to you to choose to be who you know you are. And if you don't want to be that, that's fine. Once again, like, no sweat. All right, so let's continue. So it says, the grant of the charter was accompanied by the following words of the king. We, greatly commending and graciously accepting of their desires for the furtherance of a so noble work, which may, by the providence of Almighty God, hereafter tend to the glory of His divine majesty, and propagating of Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God, and may in time bring the infidels and savages living in those parts to human civility and to a settled and quiet government, do by these our letters patents graciously accept of and agree to their humble and well-intended desires. All right, and that's what the talk of in regards to the charter, the first part of the Virginia Charter. And then for those of you who want to read the rest of it, the management of the charter, you can read on your own time, which you need to read it, especially once you start recognizing that this is who you are. All right, so let's go ahead and read the committee report. All right, so this is the Virginia committee report. So you see, all roads right now is tying us back to Virginia. Virginia is the key element in understanding, especially the issues with the Englishman, as well as what we call the Empire of the Father. So the status, all of this in regards to us losing who we are and having the rights to our children as Englishmen here in America, it starts in Virginia. Virginia is the place that it starts at for us to actually understand why we're dealing with this. All right. So it says a report of a committee from Assembly concerning the freedom of Elizabeth Key, 1656, and this is a primary document, brothers and sisters. So it says context on July 21st, 1656, in a report of a committee from an assembly concerning the freedom of Elizabeth Key, the General Assembly ruled that the slave Elizabeth Key should be freed. All right, so as you can see, they enslaved her underneath the term so-called Negro, when she was already supposed to be freed under her indentured servitude, but based off of them lying, and trying to extend her indenture or her servitude, it caused her having to go through these corridors to get her freedom. And it's good that she knew who she was, as well that her father did what he was supposed to do in setting up her guardianship, so that way she had that proof to be able to corroborate with her claim in court, so therefore she can be freed. And once again, she stood on the fact that her father was an Englishman and that she was a Christian, part of the Church of England. All right, so the full text. And the transcription source, William M. Billings, ed. The Old Dominion in the 17th Century, a documentary history of Virginia, 1606-1689, Chapel Hill, the University of North Carolina Press, 1975. For anybody, once again, who want to know where the source of this information is coming from. All right, so it says the full text. It appears to us that she is the daughter of Thomas Key by several evidences and by a fine imposed upon the said Thomas for getting her mother with child of the said Thomas, that she hath been by verdict of a jury and panel 20th of January 1655 in the county of Northumberland, found to be free by several oaths which the judge desired might be recorded, that by the common law the child of a woman slave begot by a free man ought to be free, that she hath been long since Christian, Colonel Higginson being her godfather, and that by a report she is able to give a very good account of her faith, that Thomas Key sold her only for 9 years to Colonel Higginson, with several conditions to use her more, respectively, than a common servant or slave, that in case Colonel Higginson had gone for England within 9 years, he was bound to carry her with him and pay her passage, and not to dispose of her to any other. For these reasons we conceive the said Elizabeth ought to be free, and that her last master should give her corn and clothes, and give her satisfaction for the time she hath served longer than she ought to have done. But for as much as no man appeared against the said Elizabeth's petition, we think if not fit a determinative judgment should pass, but that the county or quarter court, where it shall be next tried, to take notice of this, to be the sense of the burgesses of this present assembly, and that unless the original torn shall appear to be executed in the reasons the original torn opposite part judgment by the said court to be given accordingly. Charles Norwood, Clerk Assembly, James Gaylord hath disposed that this is a true copy. James Gaylord. So this is once again the committee themselves setting Sister Elizabeth Key free. Sister Elizabeth Key Grinstead free, based off of the evidence that has been presented to them, and mainly in regards to her father being an Englishman, aka a free man, and it didn't matter that her mother, in this case, they said was not a free woman, or that she was a slave. The fact that her father was a free man, aka an Englishman, was enough to free her. Now, the aftermath of this. The aftermath. Because there's always some form of a ramification when something goes opposite of what the orchestrators wanted to go. They're directing the flow of the colonies and the reconstruction of how they want society to go, based off of now they have to find some type of way to have control of the child or the father's children, and only in the English father's children. Because remember, they've been trying to remove the English people out of position, going all the way even before King James. This is going all the way towards the time of the Plantagenet or the 100-Year Wars, when ended up happening was the fall of the Plantagenet dynasty. And they've been trying to once again remove anybody who had ties and connections to the Plantagenet Empire or the Plantagenet or the Angevin dynasty, which was a lot of people. And only way for them to make sure that the dynasties then weren't rebuilt were by removing the heads out of the picture, aka start removing the fathers out of the picture. And this was an orchestrated event that took place because of a lot of the fathers. Once again, we were at war, and to make sure that our children were going to be taken care of, we had to set up guardianships for them, and the guardianships were going to be done through the courts, who the courts had appointed someone, and this was someone who the court was going to utilize and working in the court's favor to not only take away the rights of the child, but also take away the rights of the father. All right, so this is once again the aftermath. So let's read. As a result of Elizabeth Key freedom suit and similar challenges, in December 1662, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed a colonial law to clarify the status of children of women of Negro descent around doubts that had arisen whether children got by an Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free. All right, pause. So like I'm explaining to you, I'm an Englishman. Always have been, always will be. All right. Now, if my children's mothers don't recognize themselves as being English women based off of them claiming themselves to be, which we call the term black today, they will qualify underneath the term as women of Negro descent. All right. So women of Negro descent around doubts that have arisen whether children got by an Englishman upon a Negro would be slave or free. It required the children born in the colony to take the status of the mother, this underneath this status, the status of the mother, whether bond or free, using the principle of partu sequitur venturem. The statute was a departure from the English common law tradition in which a child of English subjects received their social status and an obligation of support from his father. Pause. So as we can see, partu sequitur venturem is literally usurping the rights of the father by them already make sure that the mother is in an incapacitated position underneath that status of being black. She have no rights. She have no privileges underneath that status beyond whatever rights and privileges they give you. And then you consider non-descendable, non-inheritable underneath these statuses, which is technically considered civiliter mortuus, dead in the eyes of law. So now the child, they want to follow that too, to keep you in perpetual bondage by removing the understanding and the rights of the father, who was an Englishman. So it says, some historians believe the law was primarily based on the economic demands of a colony that was short on labor. Pay attention. It said the law was primarily based on the economic demands of a colony that was short on labor. But what's going on today? They're creating more single-parent households by having these mothers be underneath these mindsets that has been literally orchestrated by the corporation. The corporation is what? The colony, the plantation, these companies. They're creating this mindset to keep you underneath the status partu sequitur venturem, so therefore that they can maintain their slave workforce. And where are they getting majority of the slave workforce from? The prison system. Yes, brothers and sisters, the prison system. Majority of the prisoners, if you do the statistics, I ain't say ask them, you do the statistics, I will pull it up right now. Majority of prisoners or criminals come from a single parent household ran by mothers. And as we can see, the mothers themselves are underneath the status of partu sequitur venturem. And as we can see, what historians have said, it was created because they needed to maintain a workforce for the colony. And the colony is technically still here underneath what we call the states. So they need to keep workers coming. And it didn't matter if you was a man or a woman underneath the status part 2 sequitur for them at this time, because everybody came from a woman after 1662. All right. So, but it also freed the white fathers from acknowledging the children as theirs, providing financial support or arranging for apprenticeships as they were required to do in England, or emancipating them. Some white fathers, and remember, white is just a status, it had nothing to do with complexion. Some white fathers did not take an interest in their mixed race children and passed on social capital such as education or land. Many others abandoned them. All right, so as we can see, the POSs historically and as POSs presently, who don't want to do their obligation of taking care of their children. But we can say for sure. Why does that keep doing that? We can say for sure that underneath the English common law, that the fathers were supposed to be taking care of their children, whether legitimate or illegitimate. So that is something, as we can see, America is still keeping up, still trying to make sure that men are taking care of their children. But underneath English law, the children are supposed to be underneath the status of the father, which means that the children will technically be living with the father. The father would be the head custodian. It won't be this what's in the best interest of the children, because what's in the best interest of the children be historically what it was for the best interest of the children. That was for the children to be underneath the status of the father. And as now we can see, because of the children, and not all fathers, not saying that all fathers are good caretakers, but we can say statistically, based off of the results, that fathers do a very well job in maintaining order, discipline, and structure within the household for children to be reared in properly, to be able to come out here to have themselves operating in society as functioning adults. Because underneath the English common law and underneath the value system, a father was supposed to maintain and make sure that the child will have the proper apprenticeship, in this case we'll say trade or skill, to be able to be a productive subject. And when we say subject, just mean citizen in another case, but I don't like to utilize that term, citizen. You're subjects in the crown of the realm. So we have to kind of go back to the mindset that our predecessors used for us to go ahead and fix this conundrum that we're dealing with. Because if you continue to keep living a life underneath the corporate mindset of the merchants, you're going to eventually find your demise, because you're going to get dissolved. All right. So it says other European colonies and later American states passed similar laws which enslaved all children born to enslaved mothers. If they had free white fathers, as many under the power conditions of the time, the fathers had to take separate legal action to free their children. You hear this? Let's reread that. Other European colonies and later American states passed similar laws which enslaved all children born to enslaved mothers. If they had free white fathers, so I'm going to say if they had English fathers, as many under the power conditions of the time, so many of them, just like our predecessors, because there are English predecessors, our English forebears, the fathers had to take separate legal action to free their children. So as you can see, since the empire of the father have failed because of these crooked judges, we have to take separate legal action to free our children. And to free them, we still have to enforce the fact that they are English children, and they're underneath the customary practice and the rights of our predecessors, going all the way back to time immemorial. And then also too that they're part of the church, just like our predecessors were. Which church is that? That's the English church, known as the English Church of England, not the Roman Catholic Church of England, the English Church of England, not the Church of England that you see over there that was so-called created in 1534, but the original so-called English church that can go all the way back to before the time of Rome. All right, before Rome even knew that we existed. English church. All right, and then it says. And in the early 19th century, following slave rebellions in which free blacks played a part, the legislators of the South made such manumissions more difficult, requiring an active legislator for each manumission. So you have to actually go to court, to like not just court, but like the General Assembly, Congress, to get freed. All right, and they also imposed legal restrictions on the rights of free people of color. After the American Revolutionary War, so as you can see, they tightened up them rights and moving you away from your nation to get you to the point where you don't know who you are, so you have no choice but to be what they want you to be. All right, so it says finally, after the American Revolutionary War, the new Constitution counted enslaved people as only 3/5 persons and figuring apportionment for congressional seats as compromise between the slave states that wanted to obtain greater representation by counting enslaved people as whole persons and free states that feared being dominated by the South. Northern states generally abolished slavery in the early 19th century, sometimes gradually. Northern territories such as the Northwest Territory and the new states admitted to the United States in the northern latitudes prohibited slavery. States settled by Southerners such as Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, and those of the Deep South authorized slavery. Only in 1865 did the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution end slavery in the South and across the United States, except for people enslaved by Native Americans who were not freed by American Indian law until 1 year later in 1866. And then it says, Elizabeth Key Grinstead, her descendants include actor Johnny Depp, her 8th great-grandson, and Depp's daughter, actress Lily Rose Depp. All right. So, there you have it, brothers and sisters. In regards to who is Elizabeth Key Grinstead. Now, with that information, the terms, once again, that you have to understand here is that indenture was a term that was limited to contract of labor, unfree, but not automatically lifelong. So it was completely separate for slavery. Slavery is lifelong. Indenture, not lifelong. And the baptism or Christian, because in many early disputes, Christian identity was treated as legally relevant, though inconsistently and increasingly subordinated to racialized categories. All right, so like English was considered so-called quote-unquote a racial category, but you being English and a Christian coincided with you having more free or leeway during the times in the colonial occupation, because that's what was running the joint. All right, the general court, the county court, the colony's legal layers was the local courts plus the higher review. So those were the ones who were dealing with this situation. Was the local court wanted to keep her in bondage, but the higher courts clearly recognized what was taking place and who she was based off of the evidence that she presented. So as we can see, even still today, brothers and sisters, our issues aren't really the so-called higher courts, and in general, it's the lower or the local territories that you're encompassing that is causing many of you your issues, which is going to require you to have to go to a higher capacity or a higher venue to go ahead and get the remedy that you seek. Like Sister Elizabeth Key Grinstead did. Follow her footsteps in regards to what she did, because what she did, so can you. All right. So part 2, sequitur videntrem. So once again, the doctrine that the child's status follows the mother, Virginia effectively adopts this logic in 1662. So once again, fathers, this is when you lost your power in 1662, and this is also going back to the orphan courts, and the other one I wanted to talk about. I can't think of it right now. But in regards to determining whether children are bonded free. So 1662, part 2, sequitur videntrem, taking place right after Sister Elizabeth Key Grinstead. So her case was paramount to set the tone in regards to who we are, to understand how to do it. But then after that, shows that they try to curve that route, and so it has to be other avenues, but still maintain that narrative to move through the corridor to get through. So she's the key. Elizabeth Key, she's the key to get through, as we can see, to get through the door. Her information, her knowledge is the key. All right, and then as we can see, so once again, even though so she lived in the 17th century Virginia, and is documented in the historical record mainly because she became the legal problem that the colony can ignore. And according to the modern synthesis, Key was the daughter of what we see the Thomas Key, who was an Englishman, and then her mother, who once we said once again, the African woman, which could have been just a melanated woman from either Spain, North Africa, Portugal, even Great Britain, Germany. We don't know, but the fact that they said that she was African lets you know that she was melanated or had darker brown, copper color skin. Um, and then happens is the heart of her story was because her custody and labor status transferred once her last indenture was up to a new estate, which was the estate of Colonel John Moultrie, who was in Northumberland County. And when Moultrie dies, his ministers of his estate wanted to treat Elizabeth and her child as part of a so-called perpetual slave bondage, rather than someone who should have been released at the end of her term. So this is where her law becomes her biography, because the colony's labor system at this time, as we see, was hungry. They needed to get their head count up to get the work done. So they need bodies. And the only way for them to have bodies is they needed to have someone who they can literally force do it. So, but it's also still, like they said, legally unstable at this time, because her issue was she was still arguing over whether a person's status is governed by the contract, or in this case, they were arguing whether her status was still governed by her contract, by her religious identity, or by her father's status. And by that alone is what had put her in a position of instability, which required her once again had to seek her remedy through a higher court. All right, and then ultimately, like we said, the backlash of her getting this remedy was them pretty much setting up partu sequitur videntrem, and with them setting up partu sequitur videntrem, I'm going to pull up her father's coat of arms. Them setting up partu sequitur videntrem pretty much disinherited the child from being able to take the status of the father. In this case, she was able to once again maintain hers because she knew who she was. And this is the coat of arms, the key in the middle of the pyramid, definitely symbolic, and there's 3 keys. Etymology of key. The name Key is part of the ancient legacy of the Anglo-Saxon tribes of Britain, so this let us know that she is an Anglo-Saxon Berber in this case, and is the product of the family lived near a dock and may have been employed there, having derived from the Old French word quai, which became key, and key in Old English. These were all words for docks of quays. The original bearers of the name undoubtedly lived near some docks and could easily have been workers there. And as we saw on the image of the map, Warwick County is right there by the water, so that makes sense. There's also possibility that the names derived from the Latin personal name Caius, a name that dates from the Roman occupation of Britain. There's records of Britius Filius K in 1199 in Northants. Filius means son of. There's a third possibility in the north of England, Ka or K was a word for a jackdaw, derived from Old Scandinavian, was often applied as a nickname. Some nicknames became surnames, and this could be one of them. However, the majority of examples of this name found in England are of the local type. This makes the name a polygenetic name, which means that it arose spontaneously at different times and places and meant different things. All right. And that's the key surname. Let's see if it has Elizabeth on here. Here you go. Oh, that's Eliza. Excuse me. Elizabeth Key. Okay, well, they don't have Elizabeth Keys on here, but her name. But yeah, this is her family lineage, going all the way back to Great Britain, aka the Anglo-Saxons. So hopefully this information, once again, brothers and sisters, was enlightening for those of you who have been paying attention. It is, like I said, Black History Month. Black in law means civiliter mortuus. So I'm coming to bring you the knowledge that you need to bring you back to full life, which will bring you to the light. Light in this case means white. So this is the gospel. This is the truth, and it's supposed to come and bring you this information based off of literacy. So we're utilizing the faculty of literacy through intelligence of the mind to come and utilize our faculties or our senses, our common senses, to be able to bring this back to you, brothers and sisters. So with that being said, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe. I love you. Hopefully you now know who Elizabeth Key Grinstead is, and you can now put yourself in the positions that she did by following her footsteps, because what she did is the same thing that I have done. And if I can do it, if she's done it, and the other brothers and sisters can do it, so can you. So don't forget to take care of yourself. Continue to keep loving your neighbors, and check out for the next video coming soon. Peace.